The Trail from Hope, Chapter 7. I was panting as we ran down Main Street, still tired from the run to town from the Johnsons, but the adrenaline rushes had taken the most out of me. While hunting, you get an adrenaline rush when you see the deer that you are hunting. You line up your shot and ready yourself to pull the trigger. It is much different when you are in a gunfight situation. The thing about hunting is the animals don't shoot back. When you are in a gunfight, your heart starts working overtime and your senses heighten. Everything you see stands out more than if you were just looking at it. Small details emerge and slight movement catches your attention. Everything you hear becomes deafening, yet you hear everything. The fight or flight instinct kicks in overdrive and your body reacts in quick bursts of motion, and your body has a slight uncontrollable shake. At least that's what it's like for me. Then once the danger is over and that adrenaline subsides, it leaves you feeling drained and weakened. Now, normally our main street was usually quiet, and had people strolling along the sidewalks or in the road. The sight that lay before me now was hard to look at. Both sides of the street were burning, and there was smoke, shell casings, and bullet holes everywhere. There were men and women in our quiet little town who were lying dead in the streets in contorted positions that seemed unnatural. By the number of bodies, I knew that the town had relatively empty. It was Tuesday, so there were not many people in the streets today, but the ones that had been there were now dead. Nat wondered if the pirates would start a systematic raid of all the homes around town, or if they were just doing a smash-and-grab type raid of the town. She hoped it was the latter. The sight of the dead townspeople made her sick. But she tried to ignore the bodies. Tears were running down her face, and she quickly wiped them away and continued running. The town was small, and Nat wondered where the pirates were going. They had the fuel, and there was nothing left in the town that would be much of value for the pirates. "Dad, where are we running to?" There was a pause before he answered me. "Men like these usually stop during their raid to enjoy their plunder." I knew what he was talking about, but I tried to put the thought out of my mind. "So why haven't we seen them yet?" I asked. "Because they haven't stopped," he said grimly while looking over his shoulder. "These men have perfected their tactics over years of terror and know what they're doing. But that also gives us an advantage." The man I saw for a second was not my father, but a military man. A ranger that knew what he was doing. He was a soldier, moving towards an objective, and with a mission. A mission I was sure I was not prepared for. I had my hunting rifle across my back, and was carrying the AK. But I couldn't remember if I'd even checked to see if the damn thing was loaded after I picked it up. A dumb mistake, I thought to myself. After all, what good is a rifle if it's not loaded? So, while running, I pressed the magazine release and looked at the magazine. It was loaded, and so I went to put it back in the rifle when suddenly I ran into a brick wall. At least that's what it felt like. And with a grunt, I fell to the ground. Dad turned and looked down at me, and held out his hand to help me up. "Quickly," he said as he pulled me up and then hurried me to the side of the road. "Get behind the building." We hurried off of Main Street and along the side of one of the buildings until we were behind it. The two of us were behind the building, and I used it as a chance to catch my breath. As I sat there, with my butt in the dirt and my back against the block building, I tried to listen. Dad had gotten off the road for a reason, but I still wasn't sure what the reason was. As I listened, I started to hear the rumble of a vehicle getting closer to us. They were coming this way. That's when I looked back down at the AK I had picked up and realized there was no magazine in it. I must have dropped it when I ran into the back of Dad, and I had left it in the road. I scoffed at myself for not realizing I had dropped it and felt dumb now holding a rifle with no magazine. Trying to right my wrong, I pulled the back of the bolt to ensure that there was a round in the chamber. There was. Then I pulled one of the mags I had picked up along with the rifle and tried to insert it. My hands were shaking, though, and so I was just fumbling with it. That's when Dad bent down and took the rifle and magazine from my hands and put it in for me. He looked at me and nodded his head as he handed me the rifle. I nodded back and made sure that the safety was off. I had to be ready to fight. We hunkered down, and a minute later, around 5 trucks passed by the building heading back towards the bank and gas station. They were moving slowly, yelling and shooting at random buildings, celebrating their victory. I pressed myself up against the wall, hoping that they would pass by us and not see us. There just seemed to be too many. Maybe 20 men in total, all brandishing weapons and rotten smiles. Had they heard the gunshots from the bank, I wondered? Were they going back to help their men that were now dead? What would they do when they found their men dead? We had made Mr. Weinstein leave the bank and head into the woods, but the pirates might look for revenge after finding their men dead. I thought I heard my dad say something, which brought me back out of my thoughts, and I looked over to him. But he was still peeking around the building, watching the convoy pass. They soon passed us, and we made our way back into the road. "Where are they going now?" I asked. "It seems that they might be done," my dad said. Then, from the direction they had just left, we heard the screams of a woman. I looked at my dad, and he looked at me. It seemed that not all of the pirates had been in those trucks. We immediately made our way in that direction. We ran behind a couple of buildings until we started to come upon the scene, and ducked beside the building that used to be a dry cleaner. About 50 yards in front of us, on the other side of the road, there were 2 beat-up trucks, with 3 rough-looking men. "Keep down," Dad said as he made his way along the building. I followed him. We came to the corner of the building near the road and stopped. I looked at the men for a few moments. It seemed like they were just milling around and joking. I could hear laughter, and they were passing around a bottle of booze. Their friends must have been inside, but there was no way to tell how many there were. Dad seemed to be planning something in his head because he kept looking up the street and back towards the men. "If anything happens," he said, "go back to Nick and keep him safe. He will probably be up in the rocks." "What are you going to do?" I asked. He looked up the road again and back to the men. "Well, it may not be ideal, but I think the best plan is to take these men out as quickly as possible." "Why?" I asked. "Well, with them having reinforcements so close, it would not be ideal to allow these men to take cover in the building or behind their vehicles. So the best option would be to move quickly and take them out before their friends have a chance to come back and help them." Dad checked his AK again. Then I saw his hand move to his pistol, knife, and tomahawk, slightly lifting each and letting them fall to rest in their holsters and sheaths. He was ensuring they were clear and that he could easily access each of them if he needed. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. I too made sure that my knife was clear and in its sheath and that my AK was off safe. He moved to the side and put his hand on my shoulder, and guided me to a kneeling position at the corner of the building where I had a full view of the man across the street. The building was 1 story, with windows across the front starting at about the hip height and continuing up just below the roof. The door was a double door that opened out towards the street. The 2 trucks were off to the right of the front door, parked almost perpendicular to the building. There were a few chairs out front, but that was about it. The 3 men were standing there behind the pickup closest to the door. One was sitting on the lower tailgate, and the other 2 were standing on the other side of him. "Now," he whispered, "I'm going to charge across the road when those 3 men aren't looking. I'm going to try and get as close to them as I can before opening fire. Now, if they see me, I want you to take out the man on the left. Then just aim at the door and shoot anyone who comes out. If they don't see me, then your signal is when I yell or open fire. Do you understand?" I looked up at him and nodded. "Okay," he continued. "After you take out the first man and aim towards the door, I want you to shoot everyone that comes out in the chest, and no lower. I don't want any of the rounds hitting anyone in the building that might be taking cover or laying down. So try and shoot anyone coming out in the chest, alright? The rounds from these guns will go straight through that building, and I don't want to hit any of the women that's in there. I don't know how many men are in there, but after the shooting starts, you can't stay here long. Maybe 30 seconds. After that, you need to move across the street to me. If there are still men alive in there, then we have to break contact and move into the woods on the other side and make our way back to the house. What about our people in the building? I asked. Well, if you get all the pirates, then I will run in and try to get them moving forward into the woods. But the rest of them are probably going to head back this way once they hear the shooting. If we can get our people out, then we will. And if we can't? I asked, with tears forming. Dad looked at me for a few seconds before continuing. We won't be much help to Nick or anyone else if we're dead. Natalie heard this and realized what it meant immediately. No matter what, the two of them had to stay alive. I took in this information for a second and thought about it before nodding my head yes. I raised the AK and brought the man on the left into the sights. After a few seconds of no movement, I lowered the gun and looked up at Dad. He was just staring at me. He had a somber expression on his face and was staring into my eyes. If I'm asking too much of you, Natalie, you need to let me know now. I swallowed, but I did not break eye contact. This is our town, Dad. Let's get these assholes. He bent and kissed me on the forehead. I love you, daughter. I nodded again and brought the rifle up and aimed it at the man on the left. I tried to steady my breathing by slowly breathing in, then slowly breathing out. I made sure I was aiming with both eyes open and put the sights on the man on the left. Then Dad was off. He was in the parking lot of the general store in a second. Before any of the men knew it, what was happening, his first shots rang out. I waited a second, and the man on the left moved. I saw him bringing his rifle from where it slung on his shoulder. But before he could bring it around, I squeezed the trigger. The gun immediately fell, and I turned and aimed at the double doors as Dad dropped the two other men. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dad run between the trucks. A few seconds later, the doors to the general store flew open, and 3 big men with rifles rushed out. They were pulling up their pants, interrupted in the middle of their heinous act, and throwing up their rifles. I started to pull the trigger and send rounds at the men. For a second, that small corner of our town was a war zone. The glass windows around the door exploded as bullets shattered them. I kept the rifle pointed at the men and kept shooting until the rifle was empty. It took me a second to realize that it was empty. But then I grabbed another mag out of my pocket and went to put it in the rifle, when I realized I had not dropped the empty mag. I fumbled for a second to drop the empty and load a new magazine. Then I chambered around and pointed it back at the building. I was about to pull the trigger when I heard my dad yell, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" I lowered my rifle to get a good look across the street, but couldn't see much with the smoke. My eyes and lungs stung from the sulfur and the smoke from the rifle. I coughed and reached up to try to wipe my eyes when I heard my dad yell again. "Natalie! On me now!" 30 seconds. I was supposed to come across the road after 30 seconds. Had it been that long? I wondered. Had it been longer? I wasn't sure, but I stood and raced across the 4-lane street to the general store. My dad was checking on the 3 men that were dead at the door when I got to him. He pulled a walkie-talkie off of one of the men, then looked up at me. "Grab some AK mags and take this belt," he said as he pushed the belt at me before going through the doors to the store. It was a military type of belt with a pistol on it, as well as a few pistol mags. I put it around my waist and buckled it as I followed him through the door. Once inside the general store, I saw Dad hold up his hand from behind the counter about 10 feet away. "Stay there," he said. I stopped and watched him kneel behind the counter. I heard someone crying, but could not make out what they were saying. After a few seconds, I started to look around. I had been here many times before, but it was usually well kept. Now it was destroyed. Shelves were toppled, and canned foods, fishing line, tarps, and other assorted items were lying just everywhere. The place had been torn apart. While looking around, I thought I heard someone. I spun around to the right and realized that Mrs. Hofford was lying on the ground, with a shelf on top of her. She was the owner of the store and had run it by herself for years. She seemed to be gasping for air, and I rushed over to her to try and help. I dropped to my knees and went to pull her head up, when I realized why she was gasping. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and she was trying to catch air. Her windpipe was exposed, and blood bubbled each time she tried to draw a breath. I wanted to help her, but just as I was about to ask what I could do, she drew her last rugged breath, and then became silent. Her eyes glossed over, and she was staring at the ceiling, just like Mrs. Johnson. I looked at Miss Hafford for a moment before standing up and walking outside to the road. In a sort of daze, I just stepped over the dead men at the door and walked to the middle of the street. Then I simply sank to the ground. My knees could not hold me up anymore. My body ached, and I was tired. Everything that had happened this morning had not spanned even an hour. Yet every bone and muscle was exhausted, and I could not push on any further. All of the death I had seen and caused today had taken its toll. Besides that, the sheer act of concentrating and being constantly scared, even for a short time, had worn me out, and I thought for a moment about just lying down there in the general store parking lot and either lying there forever or just taking a nap. I didn't know if I could go on. How could I? My world had been shattered, and everything that I had known was gone. The people, the town, my hope for the future. I figured I might as well lay down. "Get up," I heard my dad call. I wanted to argue and tell him I could take no more, but then a second later he was pulling me to my feet by the arm. "Get in the truck. Now," he said as he pulled me towards the closest truck. I shuffled as fast as I could over to the passenger side of the truck. He pushed me in and closed the door. In a daze, I put my seatbelt on as Dad pulled a man out of the back of the truck and picked up a shotgun from one of the men before getting into the truck himself. We were driving back in the direction of the bank, and I was about to ask what we were doing when the radio he had suddenly had in his hand started to crackle. "Where did you?" I started to ask, but he shushed me. I leaned in a little to try and catch what was being said when I heard the name again. Gladstone. I did not know where the radio came from, and I did not know why our last name would be on the radio of a pirate. I was about to ask my dad about it when we started to get closer to the bank, and he slowed down. The bank came into view and the trucks were gone now. The men that my dad had killed were still there, but it looked as if they had been stripped of their weapons and gear. The convoy that had just passed us had been there and taken the trucks and weapons. Not only that, but for some reason our last name had been mentioned over the radio. I was thrown to the back of my seat on account of my father slamming the gas. He tore past the bank and the gas station. Mr. Rodriguez and his son were still hanging from the shell sign as we blew past. Their bodies were just swaying in the wind. I thought about how awful their deaths had been and cringed. Then I thought about the women that were back at the general store and realized that we had just left them. I was not sure where we were going, but we were going there in a hurry. Dad, what is happening right now? Where are we going? He seemed to be focused on simply driving as fast as he could in the old truck without driving off the road. Damn it, Dad, where are we going? I shouted. He kept driving for a moment, then looked over at me. Back of the road. They're going after your brother.